exercise here. So we're going to just play out some scenarios in this one. And I guess the first scenario, Dan, we'll read it out for those who are tuning in. You're working with a grassroots sports team that trains once or twice a week for between 2 to 3 hours total. They do play a game on the weekend during their winter season. The children play various sports through the year. You've got a limited supply of footballs, a handful of goals, or it could be hoops, nets, or otherwise relative to your sport, and they're aged between 7 and 12. So, Dan, let's put each other on the spot here and consider how we might utilize the practice spectrum when planning a session for this group.
So the first bit that goes to me is, okay, what's the key information that I'm looking for from the scenario? And we can take stock of our own environments. We're just using this scenario as an example, but we might also look for this information in our own own scenarios that we have in our lives as well. So the things that I'm looking for is I've got 1 or 2 sessions. Okay, so that's going to influence what I do. I've got 3 hours max. So, okay, that's going to influence what I do. We have a game on the weekend. So how can I integrate that into our training in terms of we're looking for longer term and how that might support learning. And then we have multiple sports throughout the year. So we're probably in a short learning context. If we take a 12-month period, we're probably only playing the sport for a short period of that time. And as is so common within our context at grassroots level, is we have a limited supply of equipment, and we're probably going to lose a little bit more of that as the season goes on. And then we have 7 to 12-year-olds that have probably been sat down all day at school, and now they're bursting to get out and burn some energy. So how can my practice design account for that? So the first piece that jumps out to me is if I've got limited contact time and limited hours, is I don't want to spend too much time veering away from the game, because the further I move away from the game is the further I'm moving away from the joy, from the enhanced learning, and from the real information that they're going to need in the training environment to make decisions. So if we're thinking about the spectrum, is I'm in that small-sided game for the majority of those 2 to 3 hours. So if we're looking for an exact figure on that, and we're talking about our high percentages, if we've got 3 hours, I'm probably looking for a minimum of 2 hours of game-based activity within that, for those reasons of joy and the enhanced learning and the decision-making that can be based on real game information. How about you?
Yeah, I love it. I mean, look, the big one for me here is this could apply across any number of supports, but the age group is critical. So when I look at 7 to 12, I think, well, what's the purpose of sport, right? And if we can engage them, a good colleague of mine, Rob Sherman, a friend who's done a bit of work with us at Player Development Project, talked about if coaches can light the fire within young players, then that is success. We want them to come back every season. We want them to stay in the game. So whether that's playing multiple sports or they're passionate about 1 or 2 sports, that age of 7 to 12 for me is about engagement. We've talked about facilitating joy, and ensuring that they are really getting to experience the game that they are falling in love with, and we don't hinder that. So for me, that's the big one. I think that there is also an opportunity for those who are more engaged or more passionate to encourage them to work away from training further down the spectrum. So whether that's me and my ball against a wall, or whether that's me and my friend or sibling passing or throwing a ball in the park, those hours of doing some more isolated work perhaps will add value, but they're probably less valuable in a group context. So for me, those are probably the couple of big rocks around this scenario.
Mm-hmm. As we're talking through the scenarios, I'd encourage the audience to throw in their suggestions as well, and anything that they may think or feel into the comments, because we want this to be an interactive part of the webinar as well.
Absolutely. So let's move on to some practical examples around this scenario. So we talked earlier about variable practices. We talked about small-sided games or large-sided games. So given the age group of 7 to 12-year-old players, they're often playing smaller formats of different sports. Some NSOs are particularly good at doing this, and others are still modifying games for young players. But I think it's important to understand these are some practical examples. So looking at the one on the left to start things off, Dan, we've got a 1v1 scenario where a player is receiving a ball, trying to face forward and trying to take someone on to score. The value in this practice for you around tying it back to the 3 Rs, where do you see it?
Mm-hmm. So I see that, and I would encourage, if you're not a football coach specifically, to see how this relates to basketball, to see how this can relate to similar scenarios in hockey. because you can see that this idea of moving the ball in a forward direction, but into an opposed situation is common across sports. So thinking about the 3 R's is the first piece. Is there a level of realism? Yeah, I agree there is. We've just taken a small game that sits within the larger game. So if we imagine the final adult version of football is the 11v11, well, here we've actually just taken a situation that's a 1v1 or a 2v1 that sits within the 11v11. So there is a level of realism that's connected back to the 11v11 game. We have repetition because there's so few players involved. We have multiple stations set up, and we have few players to the number of balls that are out. We're going to see a lot of numbers of repetition, and importantly, as we spoke about earlier, is you can see that there is variation within that repetition as well. So we might get that variation within repetition by changing who the defender is, by changing the starting position of the ball or of the attacking player, as you can see in the 3 different examples there as well. So that's how I see repetition within it. And then relevance for this age group is we have lots of time to play because we're not in an 11v11. We're not stood waiting for the ball to come across to me for 10 minutes. I'm going to see that it's relevant for the age group because there is lots of time and lots of direct interaction with the ball. That's where the 3 R's go for me. What would you add to that?
Yeah, mate, I think you've really got it covered. For me, there's consequence, so I can lose the ball. So in this scenario, if the defender wins the ball, they might drive out over the line. You could obviously modify this by having a goal for the defender to score in, or a target. So then we could go into those 1v1 sort of scenarios where there is some transition and turnover. So for me, everything exists here. And as you said, this is a micro moment, could easily be a position versus a position. So in football, it could be a centre back versus a striker, for example, and they're getting high reps and opportunities to do different things. If we move to the middle, I think this one really translates across sports. So as we were preparing this, I was thinking about rugby. So maybe if you're working with slightly older players in the scenario we mapped out, this could be position specific. It could be a halfback, a first 5, a second 5 working on some kind of combination. It could apply to touch rugby. It could definitely apply to netball if there were hoops at the end and you're looking at smaller units or smaller numbers in a micro example of the game. For me, obviously, this ticks a lot of boxes as outlined on the diagram, but the repetition is going to be slightly lower. And I think as we move through the numbers from 3v3, 4v4 and beyond that, the reps will probably reduce further. So there's certainly going to be some repetition, but it's not going to be a lot of identical moments, let's say. But this is fully opposed. Decision-making is there. There's an incentive with either an in-goal, an end zone in this particular diagram. You could easily have goals or hoops at each end. And it's very much going to be engaging for the players because they're going to get a lot of contact time on the ball again. When we think again in a football context about what some national bodies have done, particularly in Europe with the likes of Germany and Belgium, pretty good case studies of modified games at young ages where there's a lot of 1v1 through to sort of 2v2, 3v3 and 4v4 football in this 7 to 12 age group. So they get a lot more contacts on the ball and that's motivating for young players.
Dave, if we go to the 3 R's here, so realism, repetition and relevance, repetition has a minus or what's a level score here compared to repetition with a tick in the first practice. Is if I'm comparing those two and I'm just looking at it, I might think, well, the 1v1 or 2v1 has all the ticks. Why wouldn't I stick with that? So what would be some of the reasons that I might move into this 3v3, like what, in particularly relation to the realism, repetition and relevance that we've spoken about?
Yeah, so I think, the constraints or the rules that go on that first practice on the left could be that once the player receives the ball in red, they have to go 1v1. They can't give the ball back. So that could be one rule. You could obviously modify that to say, yes, they're now allowed to pass it back and it becomes 2v1. In the next scenario, so that for me is me on my own dealing with a defender and having to deal with that scenario solo. In this, we're then progressing the practice to say, okay, now it's about me and a relationship with my teammates. So in team sports, they're obviously team sports for a reason. For me, I'm a big believer in individual development in a team context. And this is now where we start to link some of those ideas, between myself on my own as a player and now me with my friends as a player. And how do I link some of those decisions that I might have made in the 1v1 practice and apply those in the 3v3? So that for me would be how it transfers. Is that a fair answer?
Yeah. It feels like listening to you that the level of realism is scaling up a little bit compared to the 1v1 or 2v1, because there's more options available to me, which is
absolutely
relatable to the size of the games that we'll end up playing as well.